John Munayer. John's many academic degrees in theology, international relations, and politics gave him a strong base to focus his research on Palestinian theology, the Palestinian Christian community, and on interreligious dialogue. Please, let's all welcome John Munayer.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you here today. As a young Palestinian Christian, I have to say that Christ at the Checkpoint has been an extremely influential conferences and the people involved on my life and my journey with Christ. And it's extremely a privilege to be in the same session with Reverend Moss. And you might not remember this, Reverend Moss, but in 2014, I was at the conference and I was a volunteer. And I was the security guard at the conference. So you might be thinking, why does Christ at the Checkpoint need a security guard? Which is a good question. But perhaps a better question is, why did they put me as a security guard? I've been asked by Youssef and by Munder to speak about loving my neighbor, liberating them from Zionist supremacy. So if I very much relate to Tony with the controversial title and talk. But let me situate myself in this conversation, my personal journey. Me and my three siblings, we grew up in an Israeli school. The four of us, and perhaps one or two more Palestinians, were the only Palestinians in this Israeli school. And when I was 9, there was an incident at school. It didn't involve me, it involved my oldest brother. Kids who were older than him were threatening to tie him to a tree because he was Palestinian. Not only did they want to tie him to a tree, but because he was Palestinian, they wanted to tie him like Jesus. This is just one of many examples and slurs that we heard at school, such as dirty Arab and filthy Arab. As a kid, it would install in you fear, perhaps even an inferiority complex. A few years later, I was driving with my father to football practice, and we were picking up a bunch of Israeli teammates on the way. And I asked him not to answer any work calls because they might be in Arabic. He slammed the brakes in the middle of the road, turned towards me with the most serious face, and said, "Never ever be ashamed of who you are. Never ever change because of their racism. You change them. You confront them." This installed in me this sense of empowerment to try and confront racism and supremacy. And a few years after that, I was working, saving up for my university studies as a cleaner in Jerusalem. And I happened to clean this old lady. She was a new immigrant Zionist's house. And she was probably wanting to have a bit of conversation, and she asked who I was. And I told her I was Palestinian. And she insisted that there was no such thing as Palestinians. I didn't back down. I confronted her. The Zionist, supremacy, and racism. The next day, I received a phone call from my boss. I was fired from that position. Sorry? I paid the price of losing a job. Yesterday, Zaid, a 15-year-old, lost his life in Al-Khadir, not far from here, whilst we were in the conference. 15 years old, shot in his neck and his back. How then do we love our Zionist neighbor? We've heard Jesus' commandment to love our neighbor. Jesus is asking us to love our oppressor. How does the colonized love the colonizer? How does the oppressed love the oppressor? How does the neck love the sword? And when I talk about my Zionist neighbor, I'm talking about both Christians and Jews who live here and also abroad. Because we have many Christian Zionists who come to our land for many years and invest their time, resources, and money to oppress us. They have the audacity to come to our land and oppress us in the name of Jesus. When I speak of Zionist supremacy, I speak of the state of mind or behavior, whether conscious or not, that views white people or Jews as superior to Palestinians, either on the basis of religion, ethnicity, or the two identities combined. That is to say, any position that places Palestinians in civil or spiritual inequality is supremacy. And this, of course, falls under the ideology of settler colonialism. Even liberal Zionists at times fall under this sin of supremacy. They're often willing to do things that are only comfortable for them. They're happy to help Palestinians if it doesn't threaten their privilege. I know this is not the topic, but this is also true for non-Zionist supporters of Palestinians. In essence, Zionist supremacy is a form of white supremacy. Like other settler colonials, it began in Europe, and while having a legitimate reason to find an alternative to anti-Semitism, it sought to fulfill its mission and dream on non-European land. In many ways, Zionism can be understood as a liberation movement or theology gone wrong. And if you doubt that the white supremacy and Zionism is connected, please look at the way the state and the Zionist movement has treated Jewish Arabs and black Jews as well, how they've treated them and still treat them today. How then do we love our Zionist neighbors? Can we move from love that is simply be nice, putting your head down, forgiving, to something more like the meaning of the word intifada, shaking aggressively Zionist supremacy? We can see this form of tough love in Jesus' ministry, when he rebukes abusive teachings and behavior. At times, he even used aggressive language, flipped tables, and drove people away with a whip. In a similar manner, when a family member commits an injustice or has racist opinions, it's our jobs as family members to call them out, right? This is what makes family gatherings and dinners and WhatsApp groups so entertaining. Love can be correcting, upsetting, uncomfortable, but it is still love. Just as we Palestinians need liberating from settler colonialism, Zionists need liberating too. When Zionists view Palestinians as subhuman and view themselves as superhuman, they are under captivity. They are captive to their own racism and egos, which allows them to beat and kill Palestinians, or remain silent when they do, even at their funerals. Zionism is incompatible with love. We Palestinians and our liberation is actually the secret to Zionist liberation and their liberation from sin of supremacy. So today I wish to share with you some thoughts and the processes that me and many other young Palestinian Christians, when we have to deal with this idea of Zionist supremacy. How do we liberate our Zionist neighbors? And I'm going to talk about three main points. The first one, and this was the slide that interrupted Munder's presentation. Now you know that it was mine. It was a teaser. The first step to liberating our Zionist neighbor, we first need to liberate ourselves, our minds. When we love ourselves, then we can love our neighbor. And we'll be able to do it better when we love ourselves. This means that we need to refuse the inferior position, status, or role that Zionists place upon us. We're not the younger brother of Israeli Jews, we're not the sons of Ishmael, and we're not primitive people, as some people would put it. The mind of colonized people is always under attack, and we need to pay attention to that. Colonial projects seek to dominate the minds of the people they colonize just as much as they seek to dominate the land. These notions must be rejected. We are Palestinian Christians, the native people of the land, the custodians of the holy sites, and we've been preaching the gospel and living the gospel for hundreds of years. We should not let our oppressors define who we are. Being Palestinian is beautiful. It's creative, steadfast, fun, and most importantly, tasty. When you truly love yourself, you let people know about who you are. You're not ashamed. And if they're not willing to accept who you are, no problem. Then they can prepare for a struggle. Because when you love yourself as a Palestinian, you are going to fight with all of your Palestinian being against the forces that seek to keep you under oppression. Sadly, however, a lot of my Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters have bought into Zionist, Orientalist, and racist views of themselves. They've allowed colonial rhetoric to define who they are and continue to sleep in a colonial prison, a mental imprisonment where the invisible bars follow you wherever you are. Unfortunately, I see and hear more and more Palestinian Christians, specifically from the evangelical community and leadership, who struggle to liberate themselves from the tight colonial grip. Because you see, the tight colonial grip often comes with perks, money, position, recognition, but it comes at the expense of submission, silence, self-hate, and at times betrayal of the gospel itself. In fact, many Palestinian Christian leaders themselves replicate version of colonial powers within their own communities. Something to be aware of. I think the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus can help us navigate through this complex situation that we face with a lot of Uncle Toms. And we have a lot of Uncle Toms. Many people were actually speaking very nicely about the young adults group and our movement. But we differ very much from the older generation as much as we respect them in terms of how to deal with a lot of the Uncle Toms, the Palestinian Christians who are willing to work with the Zionists on the expense of our suffering. It wasn't easy coming to this conference. Even this conference can also be viewed critically through the lens of coloniality and self-love. Who has been our target audience? Why have we targeted in them? Who has been speaking? Who hasn't been speaking? I don't wish to talk about that too much, but it just seems at times that it's much harder to work through our own internal problems, to bring together all of the leaders and activists when international people are not involved, when there isn't an international audience, when there isn't a big stage or a platform or broadcasting. Loving oneself means self-empowerment, empowerment of your own community. Even our theology is often based on white Western sources, male sources, forgetting our rich and fertile land on which we live in. Some say that this is because we don't have a lot of sources in Arabic, right? But the language isn't the problem, it's our method. We need to look internally, not externally. To create a Palestinian theology, we must look internally to our practices, culture, art. It's beautiful, it's rich. That's our basis for our theology. For the Holy Spirit is active among the people who fight racism and supremacy and therefore become a theological source within themselves. Self-love is building a theology on the basis of our experience and suffering. It should speak in and through our theology. Only then can we struggle against the yoke of oppression and trauma. Let us move now to our neighbor. There are many areas to focus on in terms of methods of trying to liberate our neighbor. I have chosen confrontation. Confrontation is often seen as something very negative. And also I think we really lack it in our Palestinian church, specifically evangelical. Confrontation at times is uncomfortable, culturally inappropriate, and you have to pay a high price for it. But isn't this what Jesus did in his ministry? Making people in power uncomfortable by doing and saying culturally inappropriate things and paying for a high price. He died because of it. We need to recognize that we Palestinians are the key to freeing our Zionist neighbors from their oppressive identity. In many ways, their ethical success or failure is subject to the way they treat us. It is our vocation to expose the Zionist and colonial dream. We need to expose this Zionist dream because the Zionist dream is the Palestinian nightmare. And we need to expose their theology. We need to expose Zionist theology because it's not as if they're just wearing Zionist and white supremacist glasses when they read the Bible. It's not enough just to take the glasses off. They need a medical operation. It's like Zionist and white supremacist cataract. A medical operation on both eyes. That's what we need. Reading the Bible from a Zionist perspective is like reading the Bible from a Roman perspective. The position of power and privilege. But the cross prevents dominant people and racist people from accepting and embracing the meaning of Jesus. No one can oppress people, kill them, starve them, put them in open-air prisons, and then still understand and embrace the message of Christ. It doesn't work. We're in Bethlehem today, not far from Jerusalem. It wasn't the powerful, the religious leaders, and the intellects who understood and embraced the gospel, nor was it the direct audience of Christ himself. But it was the marginalized, a teenage woman, shepherds, foreigners and sick, the poor and people living under occupation who embraced the gospel and who Christ revealed himself to. We need to say this loud and clear: Zionist theology and ideology is not Christian, period. In order to understand the cross and the gospel, you have to read it through the eyes of the marginalized and the oppressed. Therefore, in this context, you need to read it through the eyes of Palestinians. To truly understand the crucified Christ, you must understand and embrace the suffering Palestinians of today. You cannot embrace Christ and ignore Yad al-Hala or Shireen Abu Akleh or the many young Palestinians who get killed every day. There's no supremacy in God's kingdom. And as John the Baptist reminds us, when he's speaking to an audience who think that their background gives them privileges, don't think you can say to yourselves, Abraham is our father. I tell you, God can raise up children for Abraham even from these stones. Zionists need to wake up from their deep spiritual and theological sleep. But of course, Christian and Jewish Zionists don't want to wake up. They don't want to face reality because the reality is ugly. So it is our job to force them. This is part of our Christian vocation, speaking to power and exposing injustices. This is exactly what our Savior Jesus Christ did. This is, of course, easier said than done. And it requires bravery and confrontation and at times aggressive behavior. And it's particularly difficult when, as Palestinians, we've experienced a lot of trauma. We're fearful. But like the prophet Jeremiah, we are afraid to confront the powers and deal with the social pressures. But we also need to remember God's reply to Jeremiah. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you. The third step into liberating our neighbor. It means maintaining integrity and equal standards. If we examine critically our own supremacy and racism, it will help us in our fight to expose the racism of our neighbors. The fact that we might be victims doesn't mean that we can't be racist and supremacist to other groups. And if we claim that specifically Jewish Zionists need to rid themselves of supremacy and racism, we need to rid ourselves of any racist attitude towards Jews. It can't be tolerated. Embracing European Christian forms of anti-Semitism is embracing the ideology of the very colonial powers we seek to fight. However, in Palestinian Christian society, embracing supremacist attitudes over the Jews is a problem, but we have a bigger problem. It's embracing a supremacist attitude towards our Palestinian Muslim brothers and sisters. It is actually quite shocking and embarrassing the way many Palestinian Christians, and indeed many evangelical leaders, speak about Muslims. Islamophobic theology and ideology has blinded us from seeing the humanity in many of our Arab Muslim brothers and sisters. We even have Palestinian evangelical leaders who raise their money this way. They go around talking to Western audiences badly about Muslims. It's online, you can look it up. And the Western audiences, of course, love it. They claim that Muslims are the main problem that we have in society. It's not rare to hear it's not rare to hear Christians speak about Muslims in calling them primitive, backwards, filthy, violent, and non-educated. The same rhetoric Zionists use to call us and describe us. How hypocritical of ourselves. We cannot seek to liberate our Zionist neighbors of supremacy and at the same time hold supremacist views of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And what is even more embarrassing is often the Palestinian Muslims are at the receiving end of the most brutal policies of Israel. We, the Christians, are the privileged in this scenario, and we must remember that. Speaking of double standards, let us not also forget of the supremacy we Palestinian men have over our sisters. Once again, we can't ask for liberation from Zionism and then oppress women in our society. And it's not enough to say that you support women and empower them and give them a position there and a position here, and then dominate them in all areas of society and the church. Our dear sister Marah spoke about this yesterday, and many others as well. And at times, I can see the reaction from a lot of the men. They might be angry, upset, frustrated, and they might be thinking to themselves, how dare they speak like that? This is the exact feeling that Zionists have when they hear us speak. The reaction of an oppressor. To conclude, I hope and pray Zionists would open their eyes and heart to their supremacy and great suffering that comes with it. For what they do to us has ramifications to themselves. As for us, we need to get our act together. We need to start liberating our mind and our neighbor, because we are constantly thinking and acting at times out of panic and survival. We're trying to survive as Palestinians in apartheid, trying to survive as Christians in a small community, trying to survive with all the rest of life's challenges. Some churches have adopted a survival type of mindset, making sure to secure their buildings, pastor's salary, and more. To a large extent, we're too concerned with our own survival. We've embraced the gospel of survival. But the gospel of Jesus is not a gospel of survival. The gospel of Jesus is ultimate victory through failure. That is why our faith is centered around the cross. Jesus did not survive. He was nailed and killed on the cross. But God took that failure and transformed it to ultimate victory. The gospel is not obvious. It's not obvious. And I fear that if the Palestinian evangelical church is missing this message of the cross, then we will become not relevant to society. and we'll lose our importance. Survival should not be our mission. Because as Jesus said, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. Thank you.